Let me start with something that is easy to misunderstand. When an avoidant woman walks away from a good man, she may not immediately experience the loss as loss. In fact, she may initially experience it as relief. The pressure is gone, the expectations are gone, the emotional conversations are gone, she can breathe again, and because that relief feels real, she may interpret it as proof that leaving was the right decision. But relief and happiness are not the same thing. Sometimes relief is simply what happens when you escape something that was emotionally overwhelming. And for someone who struggles with closeness, intimacy itself can become overwhelming, even when the person offering that intimacy is kind, loyal, patient, and emotionally available. That is where the psychology becomes fascinating. A good man doesn't simply give affection. He creates predictability. He shows up. He communicates. He remembers. He makes an effort when nobody is watching. He doesn't make you wonder where you stand every morning. He doesn't require you to earn his attention through emotional games. And that kind of consistency can be deeply uncomfortable for someone who has learned to associate intimacy with vulnerability, obligation, or potential pain. Why? Because genuine emotional safety removes the distractions. When you're dealing with chaos, you can blame the chaos. When you're dealing with an inconsistent person, you can focus on their inconsistency. But when someone is stable, patient, and emotionally present, eventually the question turns inward. Why am I uncomfortable when nothing is actually wrong? And that's a much harder question to answer. This is why breaking a good man can create a psychological conflict that doesn't disappear simply because the relationship ends. At first, she may believe that distance has solved the problem. But as time passes, she may begin comparing the emotional environment she has now with what she once had. She remembers the conversations. She remembers how he stayed when things became difficult. She remembers how he made room for her emotions without allowing her emotions to destroy his identity. She remembers that he wasn't perfect, but he was consistent. And suddenly the things she once experienced as pressure may begin to look like protection. The things she called too much may begin to look like genuine investment. The person she thought was demanding too much closeness may become the person who was simply asking for a level of emotional connection she wasn't prepared to tolerate. That's where the fear begins. Not necessarily fear that she will never find another man. She may find someone else. The deeper fear is that she may never again find the same combination of qualities that she had with him. And even more confronting, she may realize that she wasn't fully capable of receiving those qualities when they were available. That's a very different kind of regret. Because you can replace a person in your life, but you cannot always recreate the exact emotional circumstances surrounding that person. Every relationship is built from a unique combination of timing, chemistry, history, vulnerability, and opportunity. And when that opportunity disappears, the mind has a strange habit of making the past louder. But understand this, the purpose of this conversation isn't to teach you how to make an avoidant woman afraid. That's the wrong objective. If your goal becomes controlling her emotions, you're still emotionally dependent on her. The real transformation happens when you stop asking, how can I make her realize my value? And start asking, why did I ever need her realization to know my value? That's the shift. A good man doesn't become powerful because a woman regrets losing him. He becomes powerful when he no longer needs her regret to move forward. Because the deepest loss isn't losing someone who loved you. It's losing someone good because you were not yet ready to receive what they were offering. Don't chase someone into recognizing your value. Become so grounded in it that their recognition is no longer required. And this is where the story gets even more interesting, because once that good man stops explaining himself, stops chasing, and stops trying to convince her that the relationship was worth saving, something changes psychologically. The silence begins doing something that his words could never accomplish. It gives her nothing to argue with. When someone is constantly pursuing you, you can focus on the pursuit. You can tell yourself they're being too emotional, too demanding, too persistent. You can create distance and feel justified because the other person is still standing there, still asking questions, still trying to repair what has been broken. But when he becomes quiet, not as a manipulation, not as punishment, but because he has accepted reality, the external pressure disappears. And then the internal conversation begins. That's the paradox of silence. Sometimes silence isn't empty at all. Sometimes it becomes the loudest environment a person has ever experienced. Because now there is no message to answer, no argument to defend against, no emotional reaction to analyze. There is simply space. And inside that space, memories have room to surface. She may remember something he said months ago. She may remember how patient he was during a difficult conversation. She may remember a moment when he could have walked away but chose compassion instead. She may remember the ordinary things that never seemed important at the time, the consistency, the check-ins, the feeling that someone was there. Human beings are strange creatures. We often recognize the value of stability only after instability returns. When something is constantly available, the brain can adapt to it. It becomes part of the background. We stop noticing what is protecting us because protection doesn't announce itself. Consistency isn't dramatic. Loyalty doesn't always create adrenaline. Emotional safety doesn't produce the same intensity as uncertainty. But remove it, and suddenly its absence becomes noticeable. That is why the silence of a good man can create reflection. Not because silence magically makes someone fall in love, but because it removes the distractions that allowed them to avoid confronting their own feelings. And this distinction matters. If you go silent because you're trying to manipulate her into missing you, you're still psychologically attached to the outcome. You're counting the days. You're checking whether she has noticed. You're wondering when she'll reach out. That's not freedom. That's another form of waiting. Real silence is different. Real silence says, I have expressed what I needed to express. I have given what I could give. I will no longer abandon myself trying to persuade another person to choose me. That's not punishment. That's self-respect. And when a woman who is accustomed to emotional distance encounters that kind of silence, she may eventually confront a question she couldn't hear while the relationship was active. What if he really is moving on? That question can be uncomfortable because it introduces finality. As long as someone keeps chasing, the door feels open. As long as someone keeps explaining, there is still emotional availability. But when that person genuinely redirects his life, the fantasy of unlimited access begins to disappear. And that's when reality becomes unavoidable. She may discover that she didn't actually want him gone. She wanted the pressure of intimacy gone. Those are two completely different things. She may have wanted freedom from the relationship without realizing she was also creating freedom from the person who made her feel safe. And eventually the silence forces her to confront that contradiction. But remember, your purpose is not to weaponize silence. Your purpose is to become comfortable enough with your own worth that you don't need to fill every silence with pursuit. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is nothing at all. When you stop chasing someone else's attention, you finally create space to hear your own truth. And now we come to another psychological turning point. The moment she begins to understand that his attention was not something she was entitled to, it was something she was receiving. That distinction matters. When a good man consistently gives his time, energy, patience, reassurance, and affection, those things can gradually become invisible. Not because they have no value, but because human beings adapt to what is consistently available. What once felt extraordinary becomes familiar. What once created gratitude becomes expectation. You can see this in almost every area of life. We don't think about clean water until the water stops flowing. We don't think about healthy lungs until breathing becomes difficult. We don't think about someone's presence until their absence changes the atmosphere around us. Relationships are no different. An avoidant woman may experience a good man's attention as something she needs to manage when he's present. His messages may feel like pressure. His questions may feel like expectations. His desire for connection may feel like an invasion of the emotional distance she has learned to protect. So she creates space. And initially that space may feel liberating. But here's the paradox. The very attention she wanted freedom from can become the attention she later realizes she misses. Because attention from a genuinely invested person isn't merely communication, it carries information. It says, you matter to me. It says, I notice you. It says, I'm willing to invest something valuable, my time, to understand you. When that disappears, the emotional environment changes. Suddenly, there are no daily reminders that someone cares. No one is checking in. No one is asking how the day went. No one is making small sacrifices simply because your well-being matters to them. And that's when absence begins to reveal value. But don't misunderstand the psychology. This doesn't mean every avoidant woman will suddenly return or that losing attention automatically creates love. Human beings are far more complicated than that. What it can create is contrast. Contrast is powerful. You don't always understand darkness by studying darkness. Sometimes you understand it when you step into the light. Likewise, she may not fully recognize what his presence provided until she experiences life without it. And perhaps the most confronting realization is this: his attention may not have been the problem. Her relationship with intimacy may have been the problem. That's a difficult distinction because it removes the convenient explanation that he was too much. Maybe he wasn't too much. Maybe closeness was simply uncomfortable. Maybe his consistency exposed emotional needs she had learned to suppress. Maybe his willingness to stay forced her to confront the vulnerability she had spent years avoiding, and when he finally stops giving that attention, she can no longer blame the intensity of the relationship for the discomfort. She has to face herself. This is why a good man walking away can be psychologically significant without becoming a game. His greatest power isn't making her miss him. His greatest power is withdrawing from a dynamic that required him to constantly prove his worth. And there is an important lesson here for anyone listening. Never confuse being wanted with being valued. You can make someone chase you through uncertainty. You can create obsession through inconsistency. But none of that is the same as genuine love. A mature relationship isn't built around keeping someone anxious enough to stay interested. It's built around two people who can freely choose each other without needing emotional chaos to maintain attraction. So if someone loses interest in your presence because you stop performing for their attention, don't panic. Let the absence speak. If your presence had real value, you don't need to advertise it after you've left. Your worth doesn't increase when someone misses you. Their absence simply reveals what your presence was worth. Now, here's where something unexpected can happen. The man she once believed she could predict begins to change. Not because he's trying to punish her, not because he's trying to make her jealous, and certainly not because he's trying to prove a point. He changes because pain has forced him to become more honest with himself. And that transformation can be profoundly unsettling to someone who believes she understood him. Because there is a difference between a man becoming bitter and a man becoming better. Bitterness says, you hurt me, so now I want you to hurt. Growth says, you hurt me, and I refuse to let that experience destroy the person I am becoming. That's an entirely different psychological state. A good man who has spent months or years giving, accommodating, explaining, forgiving, and trying to keep the relationship together may eventually reach a point where something inside him becomes clear. He realizes that love without reciprocity becomes self-abandonment, patience without boundaries becomes exhaustion, and loyalty without mutual commitment becomes a prison. So he stops negotiating against himself. He becomes quieter, more deliberate, more selective with his energy. He doesn't need to announce that he's changing because the evidence is visible in the way he lives. He stops checking whether she's watching. He stops posting things designed to provoke a reaction. He stops explaining why she lost him. He simply begins rebuilding, and that can challenge the image she carried of him. Perhaps she expected him to remain emotionally available forever. Perhaps she assumed that after enough time she could return and find the same man waiting in the same emotional position. But people don't remain frozen while you decide what you want. That's one of the hardest truths in relationships. Time changes people, pain changes people, self-respect changes people. And sometimes the person you walked away from becomes stronger precisely because you walked away. Now, this isn't about becoming cold. That's important. Emotional strength isn't the absence of feeling. It is the ability to feel deeply without allowing those feelings to control your decisions. The transformed man can still care. He can still remember. He can still appreciate what the relationship meant. But he no longer needs the relationship to define his identity. And that distinction can create a powerful psychological contrast for an avoidant woman. She may remember the man who once pursued connection and then encounter a man who is emotionally grounded enough to let her make her own choices. Suddenly, the old dynamic no longer works. She can't create distance and assume he'll chase. She can't disappear and assume he'll remain frozen in place. She can't return expecting immediate access to the same emotional investment because he has learned something. Love is not supposed to require you to abandon yourself. And when she sees that transformation, she may begin questioning her previous interpretation of him. Was he really too needy? Was his desire for consistency actually unreasonable? Did I mistake emotional availability for pressure? Those questions can be uncomfortable because they require self-reflection rather than blame. But here's the deeper philosophical lesson. Sometimes we don't appreciate someone's character until we see what happens when they stop giving it to us. The patient person becomes valuable when patience is no longer available. The loyal person becomes recognizable when loyalty is no longer guaranteed. The emotionally present person becomes memorable when his presence becomes part of the past. But never transform yourself for the purpose of making someone regret losing you. Transform because you finally understand that your life deserves your highest standards. If she notices, that's her journey. If she doesn't, you've still won the most important battle, the battle to become someone you respect. Don't become better so someone regrets losing you. Become better so you never again lose yourself trying to be loved. And this brings us to one of the most uncomfortable possibilities an avoidant woman may eventually face. What if the next relationship doesn't solve anything? Because after leaving a good man, it can be tempting to believe that the problem was simply the relationship itself. Maybe the chemistry wasn't right. Maybe the timing was wrong. Maybe he wanted too much. Maybe someone else will feel easier. And sometimes another relationship does feel easier. But easier isn't always healthier. If a person has learned to associate emotional closeness with danger, pressure, or loss of independence, changing partners doesn't automatically change the internal pattern. You can move from one relationship to another and still carry the same emotional operating system with you. That's the part people often overlook. We tend to believe that a new person creates a new emotional reality, but your patterns travel with you. If intimacy makes you uncomfortable, a different partner doesn't automatically make intimacy comfortable. If vulnerability triggers fear, a different face doesn't remove vulnerability. If consistency feels restrictive, another consistent person may eventually trigger the same reaction. And this is where the memory of the good man can become significant. She may meet someone new and initially feel relieved. There's novelty, there's excitement, there's less emotional history, there are fewer expectations. She may think, this feels different. But eventually, relationships move beyond novelty. Real intimacy begins. The questions become deeper. Emotional needs emerge. Consistency is required. And suddenly, the old internal response may return. Pull back. Create distance. Question the relationship. Find reasons why something feels wrong. And perhaps somewhere in that process, she remembers the man who once gave her exactly what she's struggling to receive now. That's when comparison can become powerful. Not necessarily because the new person is worse. Sometimes the new person may be perfectly good. The difference is that memory allows her to see the previous relationship from a different psychological distance. When you are inside an experience, you interpret it through emotion. When you are outside it, you can sometimes interpret it through perspective. And perspective can be brutally honest. She may realize that the good man wasn't demanding perfection. He was asking for communication. He wasn't trying to control her. He was trying to build connection. He wasn't asking her to surrender her independence. He was asking her to participate in the relationship. And perhaps most importantly, he wasn't creating the anxiety she felt. His closeness was exposing anxiety that already existed. That's a profound realization, because if the problem was entirely him, then replacing him should have solved it. But if the problem was an unresolved relationship with intimacy, the pattern follows. And this is where fear can emerge. Not simply fear of losing him, but fear of repeating herself. What if every time someone gets close, she pushes them away? What if she keeps confusing peace with boredom and intimacy with pressure? What if she keeps discovering the value of people only after creating enough distance to lose them? Those questions can become impossible to ignore. But here's the lesson for you. You don't need to become the better option so someone compares everyone else to you. That's still dependence disguised as confidence. Your objective isn't to become unforgettable. Your objective is to become whole. Because when you become whole, you stop measuring your worth by whether someone chooses you. You stop competing with future partners you haven't even met. You stop wondering whether someone will eventually understand what they lost. You simply build a life that doesn't require another person's regret to make it meaningful. And ironically, that's often when your absence becomes most powerful. Not because you're manipulating anyone, but because you're no longer trying to control what happens after you leave. You cannot heal someone's pattern for them. You can only refuse to lose yourself inside it. And now we arrive at the deepest fear of all. Not simply that she lost a good man, not simply that she misses his attention. and not even that another relationship might repeat the same emotional pattern. The deepest fear is the realization that she may not get another opportunity to undo what happened. Because there is a difference between regret and reversal. Regret says, I wish I had handled that differently. Reversal says, I can go back and change it. Life does not always offer the second one. This is where emotional maturity becomes unavoidable. We like to imagine that every door remains open indefinitely. We tell ourselves that if we ever change our mind, we can return. If we ever become ready, the other person will still be waiting. If we ever understand their value, they'll still be available to us. But another human being is not a paused chapter. That man continues living. He heals. He learns. He rebuilds. He develops new standards. And eventually, he may reach a point where returning to the old relationship no longer makes sense. Not because he stopped caring, but because he finally learned what it costs him to remain where he isn't fully chosen. That's a powerful distinction. Sometimes the person you lose doesn't disappear because they stopped loving you. They disappear because they finally started loving themselves enough to stop accepting uncertainty. And if she eventually looks back, she may realize something uncomfortable. The man she left behind no longer exists in exactly the same form. The version of him who waited for every message, interpreted every silence, tolerated every withdrawal, and hoped for another chance may have been replaced by someone calmer and more grounded. Someone who can say, I loved you, but I will not abandon myself to keep access to you. That sentence represents emotional evolution. And this is where the fear can become profound. Because if she finally becomes emotionally ready after he has already moved forward, she may encounter the consequences of timing. She may realize that the opportunity was real. The love was real. The patience was real. But readiness was missing. And sometimes the tragedy of relationships isn't that two people never cared about each other. It's that they were emotionally prepared at different times. One person was ready while the other was afraid. Then, after enough distance, the person who was afraid becomes ready, but the person who was ready has already changed. That's why you should never build your life around waiting for someone's emotional development. You cannot put your future on hold hoping someone eventually becomes capable of giving you what you need. And you certainly shouldn't try to manufacture fear inside another person. The strongest response to rejection is not revenge. It is evolution. Become healthier, become wiser, become more disciplined. Build relationships where communication is mutual and affection is not something you have to earn through suffering. Because if she comes back someday, the question shouldn't be, how do I make her pay for leaving? The question should be, is this relationship now capable of meeting the standards I've developed? That's maturity. You are no longer asking whether someone wants you. You're asking whether the relationship is worthy of you. And perhaps that's the final lesson of the entire journey. A good man doesn't need an avoidant woman to regret losing him. He needs to understand that his value existed before she recognized it and remains intact whether she ever recognizes it again. If she eventually looks back, that's her story. Your story is what you do next. Never wait for someone to realize your value. Build a life that makes their realization irrelevant. So let me leave you with this. The deepest lesson here isn't about how to make an avoidant woman fear losing you. It isn't about creating regret, withholding attention, or trying to manipulate someone into coming back. It's about understanding what happens when you finally stop abandoning yourself for someone who cannot consistently meet you. A good man can be patient. He can be compassionate. He can forgive. He can give someone room to grow. But there comes a moment when love must be balanced with self-respect. Because love without boundaries becomes self-neglect. And when you finally walk away with dignity, something changes. You stop trying to convince someone of your value. You stop monitoring their reactions. You stop wondering whether they're thinking about you. You stop building your life around the possibility that they might return. You begin building your life around yourself. And that is where your power comes from. Maybe she eventually recognizes what she lost. Maybe she realizes that the consistency she once considered ordinary was actually rare. Maybe she looks back and understands that the good man wasn't trying to control her. He was simply offering a kind of emotional safety she wasn't ready to receive. Or maybe she never reaches that realization. And you have to be okay with that, because your healing cannot depend on someone else's awakening. You don't need her regret to prove that you mattered. You don't need her return to prove that you were worthy. You don't need her fear to prove that your absence has meaning. Your value was never determined by whether she could recognize it. So take the lesson with you. If someone walks away from you, don't spend your life standing at the door waiting for them to turn around. Don't become obsessed with making them miss you. Don't confuse emotional distance with power. Become powerful in the only way that truly lasts. Become so deeply rooted in your own standards, purpose, character, and self-respect that you no longer need another person's decision to determine your direction. And if they come back someday, don't ask, do they finally want me? Ask, can they now meet me where I am? Or because you've grown, you've learned, you've changed, and you deserve a relationship where love doesn't have to be chased, decoded, or constantly earned. Remember this. The greatest victory isn't making someone afraid to lose you. It's becoming someone who is no longer afraid to walk away.